Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Monica Malampalli, Executive Director of the Alliance of Sleep Apnea Partners. ASAP is a nonprofit advocacy organization very much dedicated to being patient-oriented and patient-focused. Our mission is to promote and advocate for screening, diagnosis, treatment, and management for optimal health of those who suffer from sleep apnea. Welcome to the Breathing Room. This is an ongoing virtual series to discuss timely topics related to sleep apnea. In the past two episodes, we brought to you patient and physician perspectives on the Philips Respironics recall. Today's episode is about policy perspectives, and our esteemed panelists will share with us on what policies need to change when it comes to device regulation in order to better protect patients. As we have discussed before, the Philips Respironics recall of the PAP devices is the largest recall to affect the sleep apnea community. To this day, positive airway pressure therapy is considered the gold standard treatment for sleep apnea, although other treatments have recently come into market. In conversation with the panelists, we will explore the inner workings of the FDA, their perspectives on the recall, and whether the current policies and regulatory landscape are helping or hurting patients. Finally, what changes are needed that would make patient experience better, and at the same time protect the patients by minimizing harm when devices are recalled. I want to remind our audience that this is not a live broadcast, hence audience participation is absent. We had to pre-record this episode due to logistical issues. However, no edits will be made to this recording for duration or content. If you have opinions and questions for our panelists, please feel free to write to us at info@apneapartners.org and share your contact info if you want our panelists to reply to you. All right, so welcome everybody. Let me get started off with the panelist bios. Today we have Kushal Karkia. He's a medical student and health policy researcher at Harvard University. He received his bachelor's degree in biology and public policy from Duke University, where he was named a Truman Scholar, and earned master's degrees in epidemiology and history from University of Oxford, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. Prior to medical school, Kushal worked at organizations including the Food and Drug Administration, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and the National Academy of Medicine. His scholarship focuses on Medicare payment reforms and FDA regulation, and his work has been published in journals such as the New England Journal of Medicine and JAMA. We then have Michael Tsweri, who works as a consultant for biomedical research and public health. He was an NIH health scientist administrator for over 25 years and provided oversight of sleep, circadian, and respiratory neurobiology research programs supported by the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, or NHLBI. He was appointed director of the National Center on Sleep Disorders Research in 2006 and served as a point of contact for interagency coordination of federally funded sleep activities and scientific research until he retired from the federal government in 2020. Dr. Twedy received his PhD training in pharmacology at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Our third panelist is Madris Kennard. She's the founder and CEO of Device Events LLC, an innovative medical device surveillance system. Ms. Kennard has been transforming the way patterns of adverse events in medical device usage are identified and tracked, a process that significantly helps healthcare professionals mitigate risk and make safer, more informed healthcare decisions for their patients. Ms. Kennard's expertise stems from an extensive background in public health. Prior to founding Device Events, she served as the FDA's Adverse Event Subject Matter Expert for Devices and Unique Device Identification, or UDI. Most recently, Ms. Kennard collaborated with the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette and ProPublica to uncover issues with the Philips CPAP and BiPAP ventilators. Her work has been featured in broadcast and print media. She also maintains an active speaking schedule, presenting to numerous FDA public workshops and industry conferences, educating healthcare audiences nationwide about the importance of medical device surveillance. So welcome to the Breathing Room today. I'm excited to have you here and get started with our conversation. So let me actually just to start to say, as of June 14, 2021, that's when Philips recalled breathing devices containing the polyester polyurethane foam. And these devices were manufactured prior to April 26, 2021. So we're dealing with some of the aftermath of the recall now for more than 2 years, and we're still continuing to talk about this now. So let's examine some of the issues that lead to the recall and the impact that we see today. So, Kushal, let me start off with you. And, you wrote a fantastic editorial in JAMA last year. This was in JAMA Internal Medicine in the fall of November 2022. Um, uh, that described the Philips recall as a public health crisis. So can you give us some context about how this recall compares to other medical device recalls?
Thanks, Monica. So medical devices, like any medical product, carries benefits and risks, and there's always a possibility there can be defects or issues with the products. In fact, thousands of medical devices are recalled every year. But most of those recalls can be for benign or non-serious reasons that won't necessarily affect patients or their care or their safety. Every year, though, approximately 50 recalls are considered what we call a Class 1 recall, which is the FDA's most severe designation, indicating that if a patient was to use the device, there's a serious risk of adverse health consequences and even death. And so the Philips recall was one of 50 or so Class 1 recalls in 2021. And so already it stands out as something that's a significant safety risk that's important for clinicians and patients to be aware of. But what really caught our eye was the scope of the recall. There are thousands and thousands of medical devices on the market, but Philips devices stand out for how widely they are used and how important they are to patients' everyday care. And the recall encompassed over 15 million units of devices worldwide. And so certainly that scale, which would rank it among one of the largest medical device recalls in history, coupled with the severity of the FDA's assessment of the situation, raised our concerns and got our interest into this process. Um, Recalls always take time to resolve. It takes time for the company to identify what maybe the cause of the recall was and to determine what the appropriate course of action is to resolve that issue and ensure patient safety. But the fact that the recall is going on now for over 3 years, when the average class one recalls typically resolve within 2 years, it certainly speaks to many of the challenges associated with this problem, which we'll definitely get into in today's conversation.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. You also commented that the problems with the Philips devices predated the recall. Can you just walk us through that and explain some of your findings there?
Certainly. So Philips's devices, and there were 21 different models that they relied on to authorize these initial devices. I believe 14 that were ultimately recalled. These devices have been on the market for over a decade. And so typically, if there is a safety issue with a new device, you expect it to be detected within a couple years of use. And so the fact that it took so long to identify it was a bit of a concern from the beginning. When the recall first started, there was a little over 1,000 adverse events or so that were reported to FDA that were accompanying the recall. But when the FDA did an investigation into Philips and then published the investigation on its website for the government for everyone to see, it became apparent that the company had received reports of internal testing and from field users that there were problems associated with the devices for many years back, even before they had reported them to FDA. And it was only after these devices were then later recalled that more of this data became available to FDA, which helped better understand the scope of the problem and the potential concerns to patients. The recall has been ongoing for several years now, and the real focus has been on this polyester-based polyurethane foam, or PEPUR foam. And the concern was that this foam was disintegrating under certain conditions, and that patients who were using these devices when they were sleeping could be inhaling them, and that there is a possibility for potential safety effects as a result of them. It can be challenging in a medical setting to really assess the quality of that evidence or to determine the biological causality of that relationship. And I'm sure we'll get into that more about the technical nuances of trying to assess the safety risks to patients. But the big takeaway I'd have for any listener is the fact that there were internal concerns that the company is aware of that were unreported to FDA for a significant period of time, until at which point the device was recalled.
Yeah, and I think that that is so true. Let's again just, I would like Michael and Madris also to weigh in a bit here. Is there anything, so do you, in your opinion, the FDA had no idea? I mean, it is a voluntary recall, right? So you have to wait for the companies to report that back to the FDA. Is there any way that the FDA would have known that these reports were there with Philips and the Philips wasn't sharing it with them?
Yes, so this is Madris. Certainly one of the things going on with this recall is that there had been an inspection done and there was a 483, and that's the form that is then submitted and that we can see publicly that shows that there were complaints that hadn't been submitted to the FDA when they were inspected. And even after that inspection, the delay for those reports to make it to the FDA was really just beyond what I typically see. You know, usually if there's an inspection, the reports start rolling in closely after. But with this one, the reports took till late 2021 to really even start coming in. Yes, there were over 1,000 reports over a period of about 10 years. But that being said, because of the large number of these devices on the market, I think that the risk benefit was considered to be pretty good. And then we saw how many problems there really were. And the FDA doesn't have a mechanism for collecting that data after an investigation or after an inspection. I'll circle back to that a little bit later, though.
Okay. Michael, do you want to comment here? Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you, Monica. I think one of the things that it's hard for to grasp is the network of rules by which how the FDA works, because it is amazingly complex. And the part of the working relationship between the FDA and manufacturers is reflected in those international standards, the ISO standards, which kind of define what kind of machine is being built and what expectations and safety and otherwise that the machine meets. And so, for instance, in the case of the CPAP machines, I think Kushal it's quite important to point out that these machines had been approved under a process that basically said, it's called the 510K process. And it basically says this machine works like other machines and it meets those specifications. And this is maybe a point to part of the misunderstanding, perhaps at the very beginning, and the confusion. Maybe it even contributed to some of the, hesitancy about what needs to be reported, was perhaps a flaw that was identified in the ISO standards that were applied to sleep apnea machines before 2020. When that flaw was identified, the standard was revised. It took a year before the FDA to adopt and publish that revision. And it wasn't until 2021 that those new requirements of safety and biocompatibility were put in place and put into regulation.
So Michael, when you're saying biocompatibility, are you referring to also the foam or
and therein lied the hiccup, perhaps.
Yeah, because the machines are pretty straightforward. That's my understanding. The way the machines work are pretty straightforward, but it's really the materials that you're using within, which was, obviously breaking down. And, if you know how the CPAP machines work, there's a lot of humidity, there's, temperature variations that are happening there. So let's talk a bit about it. I want to hear your opinions about that.
Well, I think what I'm pointing out is it was how, if you look at the details of the actual wording of the ISO standards that were in place when the machine was originally approved under that 510K process, that ISO standard that was in effect, defined the air pathway as being the required safety evaluation as being the pathway between the pump and where the patient connected to that pathway. It didn't define the foam that we're talking about isn't in that pathway. It's not between the pump and the person. It's between the outside air to the pump. I know it's like what, but just to underscore that once the starting around 2017, once the ISO committee appreciated the problem, they went about revising this. And now they don't limit the testing for safety. It says that the air going to the patient must be safe, and the whole pathway must be safe, which led to some other issues later on. But that is what we all expected the device to do from the beginning, right? We wanted to get clean, safe air. And now biocompatibility means that the foam that is being used under this new standard would be foam that, such as silicon and other foams, that don't easily degrade as easily. They don't produce the toxic gases. There's a chemical called phthalates.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is considered carcinogenic, and it's one of the off-gassing products of these degrading foams. So we talk about particles, but there's a whole the ISO standards that are now in place today, after they were corrected, recognizing that there was a problem, a glitch in the earlier standards, now cover all aspects, very thoroughly cover all aspects of safety in the respiratory, the gas pathway of the CPAP machine.
Madris, do you have anything you want to add here? Because I think that is, I still want to stay on this topic a bit more, because again, like I said, the machines are simple, but the foams that are being used, I mean, there are other manufacturers out there who are using a different type of foam. So their argument was they didn't see any degradation in the materials that they used. And anybody can Google the different types of foams and you will find all the physical and chemical properties listed on them, So there is some information still out there that this foam tends to be more rigid and can easily break down. So where does FDA come in their regulation or looking at some of these materials before, a device is approved?
Well, so that's a good question. The biocompatibility meetings that they were having in 2020, I think a lot of the people who attended that, and I was one of them, I was thinking more about what comes in contact directly with the patient. So we were looking at metals and polymers and mesh and things like that. And we weren't necessarily thinking about what comes through the airway of a ventilator. And that's my coming in from a non-scientist perspective, right? So as we focused on hips and knees and dental implants, the devices that get missed in that space would of course be machines like this, and also like reusable devices like scopes, which also have the potential to have breakdowns over time. And so I think that the evaluations need to be different and the inspections need to be different to address what we're learning as we go. And I think we always have to be learning.
So you think moving forward, there may be more scrutiny on third-party companies who are supplying these materials to the manufacturers? And again, understanding where those materials are coming from. Are they being manufactured here? Are they coming from overseas and from other places? Do any of you have any idea? Is FDA thinking about those things, or have you heard any conversation around that? Because I think that's important.
Well, so safety inspections overseas actually have been the Energy and Commerce, House Energy and Commerce Committee was addressing things like that. More in the drug space just 2 weeks ago, because inspections of foreign facilities are requests. The FDA can't mandate that they're allowed to be inside the facility to do an inspection. And so anytime you're sourcing from outside the country, you run the risk of not knowing as much about the materials as you most likely would if it were sourced in the US.
Michael?
So I think that brings up an interesting question, because the FDA's relies, the way the system works, and Madris can correct me if I'm wrong, but the way the system works, the FDA asks the manufacturer, what are the standards that they're meeting? And if the company is testifying in an official document, a legally binding document, I would assume, in their application when they get FDA clearance, that they're meeting that specification. Perhaps an example of the case with Philips that was a problem was when the FDA took the extraordinary step of visiting the manufacturing plant in Philadelphia. They found that the replacement foam didn't meet the specifications. It was not medical grade foam, and it had some contaminants in it. And maybe Madras, has the details of that that would be of interest. But it's an example of how the FDA starts. The starting point is the trust in the manufacturer to meet the standards that they claim that they're adhering to.
Yeah, no, I think definitely we need to learn more about that. At least I don't have a good sense of what FDA's regulations are related to that, but that's something definitely we'll be looking into and just sort of keeping an eye on what's happening there. So let's Michael, you mentioned the 510K pathway earlier, and I just wanted us to sort of shift gears a bit and talk about that process. And Kushal has mentioned that this is more of a relatively passive process, which has limited oversight. So just because the device has been approved via that pathway, and then I think I want you both to connect. Let's start off with Kushal and then connect your thinking, like why then that led to limited oversight of this pathway, and perhaps even mention what are the other types of pathways that that exists at the FDA. And just to address again, you can weigh in too, and just give our audience a bit of understanding, like why this happened.
Sure. Philips devices, just like 99% of all medical devices ever authorized by the FDA, come to market via the 510K pathway. And I think many patients and even clinicians may be unaware of the fact that the standard for FDA authorization for drugs is different for devices. That devices under the 510K pathway do not require clinical testing to gain approval, meaning that they're not required to undergo a randomized control trial with human testing to gain authorization. Some devices that gain 510K authorization do, approximately 10% of them, but most do not. And the reason for this is because the 510K pathway relies on the logic of substantial equivalence, which is a regulatory term of art, where, as Michael mentioned earlier, FDA will compare a new device that has been designed by a manufacturer to a previous version of device that could have been designed by the same manufacturer or a different manufacturer, and assess whether they are substantially equivalent, meaning do they share the same indications for use? Are they going to be used for the same purpose? And do they have similar technological characteristics? And if there are differences, do those differences raise new questions of safety and effectiveness? To some extent, the design of this pathway was well-intentioned. And it's because devices are different than drugs. When you change a drug, if you're changing a molecule from drug A to drug B, and then you ask a human to ingest it, it's possible that change could have significant changes in physiology. But for a device, a machine that could have many different components, from the coding to a widget to a gear, it's not always necessarily clear if changing a small material may affect the function of the device. And devices, unlike drugs, typically improve iteratively as opposed to new changes in mechanisms. However, the challenge becomes that most devices today, and indeed from the time the FDA has gotten the authority to regulate devices, have come to market via 510K. And if it's, one might say turtles all the way down, but in this case, if it's predicate or predecessor devices all the way down, it's very hard to assess when changes are occurring from generation to generation of devices, when those changes are indeed meaningful, and if those changes have been subject to adequate oversight. like I mentioned at the beginning of my comments, the recall encompasses 14 different models of Philips devices, and they themselves derive from 21 different models of previous devices. And at least in the summaries that are published on FDA's website, and for 510(k) summaries, there's not a requirement to disclose a significant amount of information. It's actually difficult to assess at what point changes in the foam were implemented. And at least based on the public summaries, there is not a clear evidence of clinical testing in humans. And so this is the primary way that most devices come to market. And while in many cases it can be useful to facilitate innovation, it can certainly lead to many safety concerns. It's worth noting that the Institute of Medicine, which is a national organization that sort of looks at health and safety in the United States, has actually previously recommended FDA to do away with the 510(k) pathway because of its concerns about the adequacy of the pathway to support both patient safety and innovation. And it's also worth noting to FDA's credit that the agency is currently undergoing a big reform process to 510(k) that was proposed in the fall of 2023.
Let's touch, that's interesting you actually said that. So FDA is working on a reform, but there was also the whole reason for the 510(k) pathway that was put in place was also to spur innovation and get the products out to market quickly, right? Am I right?
In part, there's a bit of a historical quirk in that FDA gained the authority to regulate medical devices in 1976. At that point, there were many medical devices already on the market. And so Congress thought it would be unfair or inappropriate to suddenly require every new medical device to undergo a clinical trial if there were already existing versions of those same devices already on the market, including sometimes by the same manufacturer. And so 510(k) was initially created as a bridge to help new devices come to market while FDA classified and risk stratified existing devices to determine their according risk classifications and their performance standards. And as often is the case in policymaking and regulation, decisions can have a path dependency to them. And so by setting that precedent from the beginning, 99% were essentially shifted in this pathway and it became the default standard. And over time, FDA has sought to develop some consensus standards on many product codes. For many devices, there are no performance standards, and it's because technology always moves forward, and it is a challenge for regulation to keep pace with the pace of innovation too. But today, I would say that it's certainly a default decision to choose the most efficient route to market if you're developing a new product. And certainly 510(k) offers that by allowing manufacturers to justify their decisions by citing previous versions of devices.
Thank you, Kushal. Michael, do you want to add to that?
That was a wonderful presentation of that story. The only thing I think we point out, Monica, you've been using the word approved. And I think that this little detail is another source of misunderstanding because 510(k) products are clear.
You're right.
That technical jargon for 510(k). And approved is limited to those devices or products that are clinically tested and evaluated with kind of taking a fresh look. And in fact, the audience may begin to hear a new code from the FDA, and it's called de novo approval, where there's a new device, a new technology, and they have fresh approval, a higher standard perhaps. And maybe Kushal Madris can weigh in on that. The other thing I'd ask my other panel colleagues is something I can't figure out looking at the paperwork is when in 2021, the FDA adopted the new standard, the new ISO standards for how the CPAP machine should be biocompatible. But did they withdraw the clearance of all the devices, or were the old devices that had been approved under the old standard grandfathered in? And it's not clear for me how that process worked at FDA, and because it looks like they were all grandfathered. They didn't have to go back and get approval under the new safety standard.
Yeah, and I can kind of add on to that as well. So, you know, the medical device manufacturers pay user fees to the FDA for applications as well. And so, you know, when I worked at the FDA, I was in post-market surveillance, which is, you know, once a device gets to market, monitoring it for safety. And there were 80 new scientists that were hired in CDRH that year, and it was, you know, widely announced. And then we learned that all of them were going to pre-market under MDUFA funding. So they added 80 new scientists to clear or approve devices and didn't provide additional people to read those reports of problems when they come in. And so there's this huge gap between congressional funding and this MDUFA funding. And I don't know that if an ISO standard changed, the FDA would have the resources unless they were to charge those companies again to be recertified or whatever process they would want to do. So grandfathering to the FDA, that seems to be their answer to everything that has come before. And so how could they make a change to the 510K when you have predicate devices that you know, and it's essentially, you know, this daisy chain, you know, they can go really far back. And you can have devices on the market like the electric shock therapy machines from the 60s are still on the market. And they don't get sent back for safety evaluation unless there's a big spike in adverse events, and then they might go back and do some kind of review.
Well, thank you, Madras, for clarifying that, because I think what you just hit on is something that could be considered. If there is a biocompatibility safety issue, maybe a more timely bureaucratic step might be appropriate to protect the public. It's an idea.
Yeah, so that's an idea, but then that's also, then we have that issue of the limited oversight too. So we can also bring in more personnel, but even the FDA's you know, ability to do post surveillance, I think we need to see some changes there too. So we're already running into a couple issues with that process there. Kushal, tell us a little bit, I think this is something you mentioned in your paper too, about the clinical implications of all of this. Let's just tie it all in together, you know.
Absolutely. Well, I think that medicine, and I say this as a medical student, you know, in between hospital shifts right now, medicine's all about trust, right? We trust when a patient comes to their physician that you can make a decision together with good information. As physicians, when we use medical products in the hospital, whether it's in the operating room or in the primary care clinic, you trust that it was approved with good evidence. And trusting that there is good evidence does not necessarily mean understanding that there's no risk. Every product will have a risk and a benefit. Trust is actually being able to make a good assessment of the relative risks and benefits so that patients can make good decisions about their health. And so clinically, the implications of a system that neither provides transparency into the level of evidence generation or the quality of evidence generation behind a device, and also does not advance new standards for evidence generation as products modernize, creates real challenges for patients and their safety. Because number one, there is a possibility that patients could be using devices that don't meet the latest standards. And number two, when safety issues occur, very frequently patients are sometimes the last to know about it. And I think this is a reason why trying to move towards more performance-based regulation in 510K, which FDA is working on, is something that can be really helpful. But I think for the context of all of the millions of patients that's been affected by the Philips recall, it really shows the need within the sleep apnea space to ensure that whether it's Philips products or other products that are out there, that we know for sure that products in the market are safe and are meeting the latest safety standards to make sure that all patients that could have been affected are notified. FDA took the rare step of actually requiring Philips to contact all patients because it was lagging in its public communications efforts. And most importantly, moving forward, making sure that any future devices are adhering to the standard.
No, I think that's such an important point that you made here, even with regard to trust. Just something that, you know, we've been hearing from patients too, when some of the people, you know, turned in their brand new devices and have been getting refurbished devices and they're older, that's upset a lot of the patients too. because I think in their mind, they think, I mean, they've just bought it, they've just received a new device. They had to turn it in and they're getting a refurbish an older device and they're not happy about it. And I think it's just one thing after the other that they've been facing, even with Philips. And I think people are still waiting. Some are still waiting to receive the devices. So I think there's just still a lot that is, um, that has impacted the patients, and they're still waiting, to hear from Philips.
Yeah, and I think if I can jump in there, I think it
Sure.
really shows why this recall is emblematic of some of the challenges we see in the healthcare system. I mentioned at the beginning that the average class one recall, of which Philips is one, takes about 2 years to resolve. That time has actually increased by 50% over the last decade. And at the end of the day, certainly we shouldn't underestimate the complexity of medical technologies and the importance of when there is a safety issue, trusting manufacturers and FDA to do the work to get it right, to make sure that all steps have been taken, all boxes have been checked, all T's have been crossed and I's have been dotted. But at the same time, it creates a sort of paralysis for patients and their physicians too, to be able to make decisions about their care. And in the case of CPAP, I think one thing that's really notable is that it's a medical device that's being used in the home out of the supervision of a physician. And I can imagine for a patient that can be incredibly stressful because you may not know if the things you're experiencing or things you're seeing are normal or not once that trust is lost. And it really underscores the importance of both consistent communication and clarity of communication, as well as timely action when these events occur. We should always trust that people in the system are working with good intentions, but at the same time, to really put that trust for patients, it's important to do all that we can as fast as we can to make sure that people are both minimized in terms of the risks they have, but also have the peace of mind about the safety of the products they're using.
Good point. Thank you for that. Yeah, Madris, go ahead.
The FDA is swayed by the fact that there will be a shortage if there's a recall. And I think I think there was a lot of consideration about leaving patients with no options if they recalled the device more aggressively. That being said, I think, the FDA then realized that it was being soft pedaled, that they weren't taking it seriously enough because, patients weren't necessarily being told to go to a competitor's product. They were told to wait, keep using the device until it was available to them.
Right.
So, Monica, I think this is a really interesting point because this was 2021, this period, right, with the COVID pandemic. PAP machines were being employed as part of the treatment of some hospitalized patients, and the need for machines that would help with ventilations was meeting a peak demand. Do I have it about right there, Kushal and Madris?
Certainly, although there are, of course, differences in the machines we may use in the hospital versus machines that patients may use at home.
Yeah, well, PAP machines were used in hospitalized patients at that time because of the shortages of ventilators and others. It was just that remarkable coincidence that this all, came forward and might have contributed to the fear of a shortage. Yeah, I have a question. At this point in the conversation, we're starting to think about solutions. And one that I've always puzzled over was, given the foam in the intake pathway, why didn't the manufacturers make it replaceable? I mean, one might imagine a cartridge, you pull it out of the pathway, you stick a new one in, you can sell it for more money, replace it as often as needed, might be needed. But it would have, I don't know, I'm just, maybe there's others, you guys might have other ideas why that wasn't considered, but it gives an example of workarounds that were not undertaken then. And as far as I know, there's no PAP machine, home use PAP machine with replaceable parts. They have a, 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 a working design over 5-year life.
You know, the FDA had made a recommendation, actually like a call for innovators, maybe 6 years ago, 7 years ago, when the outbreaks occurred from scopes, you know, to start having disposable parts, and also from heater coolers, which were used on open heart surgery patients and were contaminating the patients with bacteria that could come from the water or from the device. And so they came out and said, you know, we don't have a solution for this and we need one. And so the FDA can do that. They can come out into the public space and say, we've got to improve this technology, and it's up to these manufacturers to come up with better solutions. And both of those have happened. You know, there just was a new type of heater cooler that was released that doesn't essentially cause the same issues, to my knowledge. That's how it was presented. So I think it's a possibility, and the FDA needs to you know, make that public call right now for something that you know, you just mentioned. It's a valid time to do that.
I think definitely something. Yeah, Kushal, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think the thing I would add is, Madrasa's example of the pocket duodenoscopes is really important because it shows how you can translate what can often be cast as a problem with one actor or one product into an opportunity with system level reform. Because, as some listeners might have heard, Philips is now under a consent decree, will likely exit the sleep medicine business in the United States for a couple of years. And I don't think anyone should be rejoicing at that news. I think having fewer options in an already highly consolidated market is also not a good thing for patients too, because it can create these supply shortages, it creates problems with innovation. And so being able for FDA at this moment, at this juncture, to use this public health crisis as an opportunity to say, this is what innovation should look like for patients in this space, and these are the new standards that we hope all device makers will meet, helps open the door back up for us to ensure that we have better products that are more accessible and also mitigate some of these safety concerns.
No, that's such a great point. And I think you're right. I think some of these conversations need to happen. I also wonder, Philips did eventually change the foam and brought in the silicone-based foam, and there's some concerns about that. I think maybe there's a hesitancy to say this is safe, not knowing exactly, how those are going to function. So I guess let's see what comes about it in the future. But I think that's definitely an option the patients can have. They're already changing so many parts within the CPAP. I think the foam might be difficult to change, even just dealing with a lot of accessories on CPAP. But I think it's just one more thing, for the patients to keep track on. But we'll come back to that. Let's shift gears a bit and talk about the adverse events, Madras, because I think I do want to cover a bit here. So again, like we talked about earlier, FDA depends on the manufacturers and hospitals to report adverse events, right? And this is somewhat a flawed process. We've mentioned that briefly. Tell us more about this process and sort of your experience too while you were working at the FDA.
Certainly. So manufacturers and user facilities are mandated to report to the FDA. And the FDA really, until they do inspections, often doesn't know if that's being done as regularly as it should. Approximately 14% of adverse events that happen get reported to the FDA. And that's based on an old study, I will admit. The Office of Inspector General needs to reissue a study. But that being said, it's very indicative of what we see here, where you can see for many years that there were very few reports. I do have to mention there's a caveat to this, and that's that the FDA MOD system, which is where the adverse event reports go to be viewed, they had made a decision about collecting the data that I don't necessarily agree with. And so I've had some meetings with them. It used to be that there was a manufacturer aware date. So when a problem happened, you knew when the company became aware, and then typically they were supposed to report within 30 days. What happened with this is the Philips and other device companies that go under scrutiny are then given the opportunity to report these, and it's late, but the FDA still wants to see the reports. And what they did was they changed that aware date to be, well, when did you become aware of new information? And so it changed the timeline for many of these reports. So even though if I had looked 2 years ago, I would have seen about 1,000 reports over this period of time, the FDA went back and told them to resubmit with new information they've learned. And so those dates had changed essentially when the company became aware of an event. And I think it's a huge mistake, you know, from audit perspective. I'm sure, you know, I don't know if the DOJ is looking into it at all, how they're getting the data that they're reviewing as they look at these. But just to give you a quick view, when reports come to the FDA, they're classified as a malfunction, an injury, or a death. And along the left, you can see approximately how many were coming in that way. You also have this report source. And so there is mention often that, well, there are a lot of voluntary reports, which means that anybody can report anything at any time. And that is true. So the bulk of these reports, though, really we only have just under 1,400. So most of these reports were the patient contacts the manufacturer and the manufacturer says, oh, we'll take care of reporting it to the FDA because we're mandated and you're not. And so then you have this gap in what is received by the FDA and whose story is really being told. So just to give you a quick view, some of these, of course, we have user facility reports. Again, it's only 30. That's because most of these were used at home. They're home health products. And along the left-hand side, you can see that for the most part, there were some healthcare professionals, patients. For some reason, they classified a lot of these as other. I checked with the FDA to see if that was an error. So I'm hoping to hear back if they were classified as patients or whomever else it might have been. But you can also look, you know, there were biomedical engineer reports, respiratory therapists. But what's happened to a lot of these is because there are some lawsuits going on, a lot of these reports, approximately 80,000 of them use the word alleged, which means that they're being reported as part of this, the lawsuits that are going on. And so I think people question the number of adverse events, you know, for people necessarily being actually having the problems or then attributing the problems to the device. And it is difficult. But, you know, the way that the FDA typically looks at this as well, if we see a few that are one-offs, that's something. But here we have a signal. We have degraded, as you can see in these reports. Degraded is what we're seeing most often. But then we can look at what else is going on. Just a moment. And so here you have, these are the device problems. So, you know, patient device incompatibility. Most of these are for degraded. If that's all you see, you don't necessarily know what part degraded. You know, there are some overheating of device, smoking. There was another recall for the devices that indicated that there are some overheating problems. But a large number of these, we also see these patient problems being listed, you know, cancer, cough, dizziness, respiratory tract infections. And so there is data, you know, when these reports are submitted with outcomes such as this, there's typically related data about their health included. So I don't want to assume that the attorneys are calling the shots in these cases. You know, they are getting medical background on the patients, but you're also looking at, you know, these patients may be taking medications, using other devices, and so that can muddy the waters. That being said, you know, Philips had 120,000 complaints that weren't submitted, like these adverse events were. You know, certainly they did not follow the regulations as intended, and that is likely as much of the reason that these are being that they essentially can't be sold right now, because the FDA is in a position of not necessarily trusting the information that they're given from the company.
Interesting. So that's why you see that huge spike there, 2022, assuming after the lawsuits were
Yes.
filed.
Notifications. And like I said, many of these say alleged, but yet if you look at the narrative of the report, it's very clear that they have medical information that backs up the issues that they're showing.
Oh, okay. Michael, thanks for that data.
I have a question for Madris. You know, you've spent a lot of time looking at these databases. Were particles reported in device reports from other manufacturers? Or after 2020?
Yeah, we have seen that with some other products as well, and even with the earlier devices. So yes, they're not the only one that's struggling with these issues. Certainly, I think they've gotten the most attention. But one of the things that the FDA really needs to do as they identify issues with devices is go back and look at the alternatives to the device and make sure that those are safe as well. And you know, when scopes were recalled, they recalled one model, and it turned out I saw the same issues in all of the models. So if the device is similar, it's going to have similar issues. And you know, the FDA has a mechanism to look at that data and a responsibility to say, well, if we're going to say this is an alternative for you, we need to also look and make sure that alternative is a reasonable one.
Oh, well, thanks for this, Madras. So I think the takeaway sort of here is, again, how is that data being captured? How the database, how the things are being noted in the database. So I think that needs to change as well. So thank you for, you know, your work that you're doing and having this database for us to at least, you know, walk us through and look at some of this information. I'm looking at the time. We have a few more questions that I want to get through. So let's come back to Kushal. Kushal, I want you to talk to us about this rare step that FDA took, right? Going after Philips and basically on the delayed outreach to users. So why was it so hard for the company to identify the affected patients? And I think this is so important for even our audience to understand. And it also shows how sort of the sleep apnea healthcare was being delivered, you know, and caused a huge problem for this field.
For sure. And I think this is one of the developments in the story that really made this recall so notable. So most recalls are voluntary, meaning that they're initiated by the manufacturer, and therefore it's the manufacturer's responsibility to identify affected patients and devices, develop a plan for correcting those defects, which can either be in replacing or removing the devices, and then report back to FDA. And one thing that was important about this recall is from the beginning, it was serious because of the number of potential patients that were affected. But about a year into the recall started in the summer of 2021. And in the spring of 2022, FDA writes Philips a letter saying that it's concerned that not enough patients have been contacted because and you can even see this in public investigations and even like Facebook support groups for CPAP users saying that I had no idea my device was being recalled. And part of it is just a very simple analog versus digital problem. Typically, when we notify people about problems in healthcare, we still use a snail mail as opposed to emails. We don't collect contact information. But the bigger issue really was that we don't track devices. And what I mean by that is if you get a prescription for a medication, there is a paper trail through your insurance and the pharmacy that can identify who has that medication. That paper trail doesn't exist necessarily for devices. For a long time, it was because devices themselves were not tracked. So an individual company might track its own inventory, but there is no standardized tracking for medical devices across the country that say a doctor at a hospital in California could communicate with an insurance company based in Connecticut to figure out how a patient in Idaho had gotten this device. That didn't exist. Congress really believed this to be an issue after the GAO investigated FDA's handling of recalls over a decade ago. And so they passed laws asking FDA to create something called the Unique Device Identifier, or UDI, which is an alphanumeric code that every device would have, that would have two parts. One would be a device identifier, so it specified the specific model of the device, and one would be a production identifier, specifying where it was made. And that's important because sometimes recalls can happen just because there was a bad batch, in which case you want to know the production identifier. And sometimes they happen because there was a problem with the device itself, and you want to know the device identifier. But the problem is that these UDIs are have been implemented, but they're functionally useless because there's no requirement for them to be tracked in any kind of recall notification and any kind of healthcare data. So, for example, our research shows that only 1 in 4 class 1 recalls even include information about UDIs, even though these are the exact numbers intended to track devices for recalls. And even still, there's no requirement for UDIs to be logged in your electronic health record as a patient or administrative claims associated with the purchase and use of that device. And so for Philips, they didn't maintain any registry of who the patients were that are using their devices. And so they were actually trying to identify these patients via third parties, via durable medical equipment vendors, these people who sell the devices directly. And FDA investigated them and found that even when FDA cold called some of these DME vendors, they hadn't been notified or didn't realize the devices were recalled either. And so FDA actually took the very rare step, it's only happened a handful of times, of invoking its 518 authority, which is a wonky way of saying that FDA actually possesses the ability to turn this sort of a voluntary recall into partially a mandatory process, and in this case, compelling the company to say you need to contact everyone who's been identified. FDA also issued a follow-up saying that if you don't do this, we may also consider issuing Part B of that authority, which would require you to replace and refund all affected devices, although it doesn't seem like the agency has followed through on that. And so I think this story is important for people to know because we often think that, if our iPhone breaks or if something goes missing at the grocery store, it's really easy to track it down and find someone to help us find that specific product or make that return on Amazon. It doesn't work like that for devices. And there's no reason it shouldn't because the government has invested a lot of time and effort into building that infrastructure. It's really a problem of bureaucracy and a problem of political will, not a problem of engineering or the ability to get this done.
I was
So,
actually hired on at the FDA to build that system. So I was the project manager for the UDI rollout. But yes, I'm often standing in front of members of Congress telling them you have it and you're not using it. So unless people know, as you said, it's going to be a useless barcode. And right now I'm afraid it's on its way to becoming that.
so does the FDA have the ability? It has to come from Congress to mandate something like this. But if the Congress mandated to have a UDI, is that something that can be implemented right away?
Well, so
Well,
the FDA
sorry.
only has oversight of the manufacturers. They don't have oversight of hospitals. And so there are different parts of this, where they had to rely on like Office of the National Coordinator and CMS to do part of this work for them to try to get UDI onto claims forms so that at least we could track who had them based on claims to Medicare. And those regulations haven't been made. So they can add a field to a form, but if they haven't told people how to use that field, it's not going to do any good. I'll let someone else speak as well.
Yeah, just to build off of that, it's sort of out of FDA's hands at this point. And so on the claims form issue, which is the billing data that tracks essentially how all healthcare transactions occur, there is a room for a national drug code, which it can track pharmaceutical, but there's not a room for a device identifier. Those standards, unfortunately, aren't updated that often. And you would think, these paper forms, which are really not that complicated, shouldn't be that hard to add an extra line or two, but it really is a big deal administratively because this is how the healthcare system runs. And so there was an effort to actually update those forms. And so X12, which is a standards body that governs electronic data interchange. I know lots of obscure groups working in this, but they actually had a proposal to update the whole form. And one of the updates was going to be to include at least the device identifier portion of the UDI. And that went forward for review by the National Committee of Vital Statistics, which is a advisory committee in the U.S. federal government. And NCVHS, as their acronym goes, actually voted it down, not because of the UDI specifically, but because of larger concerns with the standards updates. And that approval was necessary for it to then go forward for the secretary to recommend to CMS to start rulemaking. I think we're in a period of a lot of um, just truly administrative challenges to figure out what's possible, what's not. And it's unfortunate that this pretty simple fix that was intended by Congress to fix this problem has become a casualty of this larger political negotiation.
So true. So even though FDA had the tool to even sort of, you said, partially like a mandatory recall, even giving them the full ability to be able to do a mandatory recall, I believe they did something like that when it comes to the spinach, I think, recall that happened a few years ago, because of the contamination issues. I think they have that authority. So it may not fully work really well because we still can't identify the patients, right? Am I
Well,
think
I want
there's
to
still limitations
differentiate.
to having,
Yeah,
that kind of authority.
I want to differentiate those 2 points. So I think certainly tracking is important just in general, because we should know where medical technologies that are used in homes and hospitals, we should know where they are, who made them, and if there are problems with them. That's different from FDA's role in the recall. FDA in general relies on voluntary recalls by manufacturer. It possesses the authority to do mandatory recalls, but it very rarely do so. I think I, along with several other scholars, could argue that FDA could take a more active role in recalls, in part because we're seeing that there are increasing delays in the time it's taking to resolve them. It should be noted that it's possible that recalls are just taking longer because these devices are more complex and there's a lot of moving parts. But at the same time, we would want the agency that's tasked with protecting the health of Americans to not be the one waiting for information, but being more proactive in terms of going out and resolving them and also setting standards and precedents for how it expects manufacturers to be moving in these situations. I think there's also a opportunity here, as Madris was alluding to earlier, for us to make this an industry FDA collaboration because ultimately it's a partnership around the products that innovators make and the rules that regulators design. Just like we set performance goals for how quickly FDA needs to review products when they get to market, it would seem logical to me that we should also set performance goals for how quickly FDA should be handling recalls when they occur. And importantly, just like manufacturers negotiate these payment rates with Congress and the FDA on the pre-market side, we should make sure that resources are there on the post-market side. So when future analysts come to FDA, it's not everyone moving to the pre-market side of the table. There's also representation on the post-market side of the table too.
Thank you for that. Michael, just a quick question with the new CPAP machines. I mean, the manufacturers are now, able to, through their apps, connect with the patients, right? Is there any, again, just trying to pick your brain here. Did the Philips have that ability to do that even through their machines and their apps? I don't believe they had an app back then, right, with some of those old devices. But now there's the ability to push messages through, or if there is a recall or anything through these apps. Do you know anything
It's
about that?
increasingly common. Certainly ResMed has used this for there to be over the air information about how the machine is used. And insurance companies and Medicare have used this information that's automatically transmitted by the machine as it's used. There was a glitch for a few years as we moved from as the communications chip for communicating that information changed. And I think this fits into the category of constantly evolving information. And then there is the reality, the socio-political reality that in the US, there is a domain of sensitivity about collecting information about what I'm doing or not doing. That isn't resonate or with the medical needs and the safety needs, but that's just another part of the process of achieving the authority and the regulations that optimally serve the health of the country.
All right. Well, looks like we're out of time. But just in closing, what is one message you want our audience to take away from today? Let's start with you, Kushal.
Well, I hope certainly that everyone in the audience is more aware of the differences in how devices are regulated versus drugs and other medical products in the United States. But I also hope, despite all of the challenges that we've highlighted in our conversation, that folks know that just because a system was designed this way 50 years ago does not mean it has to stay designed that way. Just as much as we'd expect our technologies to evolve over time, we'd also hope that our rules would evolve, both to encourage innovation while also protect patient safety. And after the Philips recall, Senators Durbin and Senators Blumenthal sent letters requesting that the Government Accountability Office, which last reviewed the FDA's recall authority in 2011, initiate a new review, in part because of this recall, and also because of the general trends in medical device safety events. And the GAO has accepted that review. And so for everyone listening, I hope that it's something we can pay attention to. And that can be an opportunity to revisit a lot of these questions that we've talked about in this conversation about ISO standards, performance-based regulation, UDI adoption, FDA's mandatory versus voluntary authorities. I think we're at a really pivotal moment to try to clarify some of those questions to make sure future recalls can be handled more expeditiously and medical devices continue to be deployed in a safe manner. And I hope that we can do so that the legacy of the Philips recall is not this public health catastrophe, but really a catalyst for future change.
Very well said. Thank you, Kushal. Madras.
Yeah, so along those lines with the GAO, Richard Durbin's office had also worked with Representative Jan Schakowsky on a medical device recall improvement act, which was announced last, I believe, November. And it definitely needs support. It's going to require that data be collected about the UDI. It will require that recall communications happen more quickly. Maybe it's tricky to know if it's going to help with consumer products as well as it might with, notifying hospitals about issues. But that being said, there are a lot of different types of devices on the market, and until a bill like this gets passed, the FDA doesn't have the funding to do the changes to their systems that are needed. And so this bill also included some funding. And so I'm hoping that somehow the word will get out about this and people will reach out to their congressman and say, this is really worthwhile to sign on to.
Thank you. And Michael.
I think that that one of the things to help make this go forward is to also look at the culture. Is it possible to communicate with the manufacturers to incentivize the manufacturers in terms of doing being good citizens and doing meeting those standards and testing for those standards, and because there's no profit in taking shortcuts, as Philips might find out.
Well, thank you all for this, for your insights and engaging conversation today. And I just want to echo what Kushal said today. Let's take, I think, what we've learned from the Philips recall. It's definitely, was in a way, impacted so many people. But we've learned some lessons from this. And I think definitely this should motivate some meaningful action. So like Kushal, like you said in your words and in your paper too, there is a reason for hope. And, as more innovation is happening, let's also make sure, the innovation is supported, but as well as patients are protected. This work is supported by the American Academy of Sleep Medicine Foundation. Any opinions, findings, and conclusions or recommendations expressed in this publications out of those of the panelists and do not reflect the views of the American Academy of Sleep Medicine Foundation in any way. To our audience members, if you want to share any stories related to the recall, please email us at info@apneapartners.org, or you can also write to us if you have any questions related to the recall or this episode, and we might be able to help you with. I encourage you to sign up for our newsletter so you can stay connected with us. Please follow us on social media. We are on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, X, Instagram, as well as YouTube. We will make the recording of this webinar available to you soon on YouTube. And you can also check out our previous episodes on this topic. Thank you again for joining us today, and see you soon. Thank you.